There is a moment buried inside one of the strangest episodes of The Twilight Zone ever filmed, where a young actress lies in a hospital bed with her entire face wrapped in bandages, waiting to find out if a medical procedure has finally made her look normal. Audiences at the time had no idea that the woman playing that role would spend the rest of her actual life fighting a very different kind of battle over her own face and her own image, one that would follow her for decades after the cameras stopped rolling, and one that very few of her fans ever heard about. Today we're uncovering the disturbing facts about Donna Douglas's final years, the woman the world knew and loved as Elly May Clampett, the sweet animal wrestling tomboy from the Ozarks. Millions of people fell for that character without ever realizing the actress playing her had already lived a version of that hard rural life before Hollywood ever found her, and that what happened to her once the fame arrived, and especially once it faded, is far stranger and far more unsettling than anything that ever aired on primetime television. Stick around, because the part of this story that happens after the show ends is the part almost nobody talks about, and it is genuinely upsetting in ways you would not expect from a sweet Southern sitcom star. Before she was Donna Douglas, she was a little girl named Doris Smith, born September 26, 1932, in a tiny rural community called Pride, just outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Her family had almost nothing in the way of money, and life on that land demanded real physical labor from every single person in the household, Doris included. There were no dance recitals waiting for her. There were no tea parties. There were cows to milk before school, chores that never seemed to end, and long afternoons spent hunting and fishing alongside the boys in her family. Because in her world, that simply was what childhood looked like. She would later describe those years as full of adventure rather than hardship, and that particular instinct, to make the absolute most of whatever she actually had rather than dwell on what she didn't, ended up defining the rest of her entire life. She attended St. Gerard Catholic High School near Baton Rouge, playing both basketball and softball, remembered by classmates as unusually athletic, and completely unbothered by the fact that most girls her age were far more interested in looking pretty than outrunning the boys on the field. That contradiction, a genuinely striking beauty who actually preferred mud, animals, and the outdoors to a mirror, would end up being the exact quality that made her famous a decade later, though nobody, least of all Doris herself, could have predicted it at the time. But before any of that fame arrived, life had already handed her one of its harder lessons. At just 17 years old, she married a young man named Roland Bourgeois Jr. The marriage didn't last long, but it gave her the one thing she would treasure above everything else for the rest of her life: her only child, a son named Danny. Born in 1954, she was now a young divorced single mother in rural Louisiana in the early 1950s, a situation that carried a level of social stigma at the time that is genuinely hard to fully appreciate today. Neighbors in small rural Louisiana towns of that era were not always kind to young divorced mothers, and Doris carried that quiet judgment with her even as she began building the life that would eventually take her far from Pride altogether. Whatever ambitions she had for her future, she would be chasing them while raising a child essentially on her own. She stumbled into pageants almost by accident as a teenager, and it turned out she had a real gift for them, winning Miss Baton Rouge in 1957 and finishing first runner-up for Miss New Orleans that same year. For most young women, that would have been the peak of an already full story. For Doris, it was a door swinging open into a life she hadn't even known existed. So she made a decision that, for a young single mother from rural Louisiana in the late 1950s, was genuinely bold. She decided to move to New York and try to build a career in entertainment, despite one small problem. She had never once been on an airplane in her entire life. She got on the plane anyway. Her earliest attempts at breaking in were modest, occasionally frustrating, and included a brief stretch as a print model for toothpaste ads, a world of constant pressure around weight and appearance that she quickly realized wasn't the life she actually wanted. Television felt different. In 1957, she made her first small-screen appearance as the letters girl on the Perry Como show, and something about her, natural, unfiltered, completely unpolished, translated through the camera in a way no acting class could have taught. Producers who worked with her during those early New York years often remarked that she seemed entirely unaware of how striking she was on camera, which paradoxically was exactly what made her impossible to look away from. Regular appearances on The Steve Allen Show and The Phil Silvers Show followed, and New York photographers eventually gave her the title Miss Byline, which she wore proudly during appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, one of the single most influential platforms in American entertainment at the time. By 1959, she had a featured role in the film Career, alongside Dean Martin and Shirley MacLaine, plus a memorable spot in the musical Lil Abner. In 1961, She played Tony Randall's secretary in the romantic comedy Lover Come Back, sharing the screen with the massive star power of Rock Hudson and Doris Day. And in 1960, she took on one of the strangest and most memorable roles of her early career, appearing in the now legendary Twilight Zone episode, The Eye of the Beholder, playing a woman undergoing a mysterious medical procedure with her face entirely wrapped in bandages for nearly the entire episode, building toward one of the most talked about twist endings in the history of the series. It was a role that demanded real dramatic restraint, since her voice and body language alone had to carry almost the entire performance, while her actual face stayed hidden from the audience. Then, in 1966, came what should have been the true peak of her film career. She was cast opposite Elvis Presley himself in the musical Frankie and Johnny, playing the title role of Frankie, a riverboat entertainer caught in a love triangle with Presley's character, a gambler and singer. It was her only true leading role on the big screen, arriving right at the height of Presley's box office power. And here is where the story gets genuinely murky, because what actually happened between Donna Douglas and Elvis Presley during that production depends entirely on who you ask. Rumors circulated for years that Douglas had quietly fallen for Presley on set and grew despondent, realizing he would never return her feelings. But those who actually knew her personally told a very different story, recalling her privately confiding that she didn't care for him very much at all. Whatever the truth of that particular chapter really was, one thing is certain: Frankie and Johnny premiered in her home state of Louisiana in 1966, drew mostly positive but unspectacular reviews, and never launched her into the bigger film career everyone around her had assumed was coming. It remained the only true starring film role of her entire career. But television was about to hand her something far bigger than any single movie could. In 1962, producers were casting a new CBS comedy about a poor mountain family who strike oil and suddenly find themselves relocating to Beverly Hills, and they needed to find the perfect young woman to play Elly May Clampett, the family's tomboyish, animal-loving daughter. More than 500 women auditioned for the part. Most of them were talented, trained actresses doing their absolute best impression of a country girl. Donna Douglas didn't have to do an impression of anything. During the audition process, candidates were famously asked to demonstrate the character by milking a goat directly in front of the casting team, a task that reduced plenty of polished professional actresses to nervous laughter and fumbling in front of the very people deciding their future. Donna Douglas walked right up to that goat like she had done it every single day of her life. Because in a way, she had, just with cows instead. She later explained, with the same characteristic simplicity that defined her entire personality, that she figured a goat and a cow worked about the same way, so she just went ahead and did it. She got the part, and Elly May Clampett went on to become one of the most beloved characters in the entire history of American television. The Beverly Hillbillies premiered in the fall of 1962 and became an almost immediate cultural phenomenon, at one point capturing an astonishing 50% share of the entire television viewing audience in America, a number that seems almost impossible by today's fragmented media standards. But there was a detail about Donna Douglas's personal life that CBS chose to keep entirely hidden from the public during those crucial early months. The network reportedly withheld the fact that their new leading lady was a divorced single mother, worried the information might clash with the wholesome, all-American image they were selling to living rooms across the country. It was only once the show had firmly established itself as a genuine ratings powerhouse that this detail quietly became public knowledge, by which point audiences were already far too in love with Elly May to care. Donna Douglas, playing the sweet, strong, endlessly good-natured Elly May, became the show's most photographed and most fan-mailed star, appearing on the cover of TV Guide 9 separate times, more than any of her castmates. She traveled internationally, representing the series, and reportedly insisted on personally answering as much of her enormous volume of fan mail as she possibly could. What made Elly May resonate so deeply with viewers wasn't just her striking beauty, it was her complete lack of pretension. She could haul hay bales without breaking a sweat, handle wild animals without flinching, wrestle alligators for laughs, and somehow remain the single most innocent, good-hearted character on the entire show, constantly baffled by the snobbery of her new Beverly Hills neighbors. Audiences found her genuinely comforting, a weekly reminder that decency could survive contact with sudden wealth, without being corrupted by it. In many ways, Donna Douglas wasn't performing that quality for the cameras at all. She was simply being herself, and audiences could feel the difference every single week. One particular detail from her time on set reveals exactly how seriously she took her personal values, even when it worked directly against her own financial interests. Her castmates appeared in television commercials for Winston Cigarettes, one of the show's major sponsors, cashing in on their newfound popularity the way most working actors of that era would have without a second thought. Donna Douglas, a devout Christian who did not smoke and did not believe in promoting the habit to a national audience, flatly refused to appear in those ads. Instead, for the very same sponsor package, she pitched Kellogg's cornflakes, quietly turning down an easy paycheck because it conflicted with who she actually was underneath the fame. It was a small decision, largely forgotten by history today, but it foreshadowed exactly the kind of choices she would keep making for the rest of her life, long after the cameras finally stopped rolling. Her closest relationship on set turned out to be with the man who played her television father, Buddy Ebsen, who portrayed the patriarch Jed Clampett. Their friendship lasted an extraordinary 32 years, well beyond the life of the show itself. She once described Ebsen as very much like her own real father, a quiet, reserved, deeply caring man, a comparison that meant a great deal coming from a woman who had grown up without a particularly present father figure of her own. When Ebsen passed away in 2003, the very same year Douglas lost her own mother, those closest to her said the double loss affected her profoundly. The Beverly Hillbillies ran for 9 full seasons before CBS finally canceled it in 1971, part of a broader network purge of rural-themed comedies that executives had started to consider hopelessly old-fashioned as cultural taste shifted. And this is where Donna Douglas's story takes the turn that anyone familiar with the history of iconic television characters will instantly recognize. She had become one of the most famous and most photographed faces in all of America. And almost overnight, that very fame became the thing trapping her. Typecasting is a word that gets thrown around loosely in entertainment circles. But for Donna Douglas, it was a very real and very painful professional reality. Producers and casting directors saw her walk into a room and saw only one thing: Elly May Clampett. They could not picture her as anything else, no matter how hard she tried to demonstrate her range in auditions. Making matters more difficult, her deeply held Christian beliefs meant she was unwilling to pursue the increasingly mature and risque film roles Hollywood was steadily shifting toward throughout the 1970s, a direction the industry was moving in almost universally at the time. She took what roles she could find in the years following the show's cancellation, appearing in episodes of Night Gallery and Adam 12, and even reprising her most famous role for the 1981 television movie The Return of the Beverly Hillbillies. But nothing ever came close to matching the cultural footprint of the character that had made her a household name in the first place. If this story is pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe to Old Tapes. We dig up the real lives behind some of the most beloved faces in classic television and film history. On top of the typecasting came something considerably more unsettling: a legal battle over her own likeness that would stretch across decades and never fully resolve in the way she hoped it would. In 1993, Douglas and a business partner sued Touchstone Pictures, alleging the studio's hit comedy Sister Act had lifted significant elements from a story concept the two of them owned the rights to. The case dragged through years of litigation. Douglas turned down a settlement offer in 1994 believing she could win outright, and ultimately a judge ruled entirely in favor of the studio, leaving her with nothing but the legal costs of pursuing it. Then, decades later, in 2011, at 77 years old, Donna Douglas found herself back in court, this time suing the toy giant Mattel and CBS's Consumer Products division directly. The complaint alleged that Mattel had released an Elly May-themed Barbie doll with packaging that featured an actual photograph of Douglas in character, without ever asking her permission or offering her compensation. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, a woman in her late 70s, decades removed from the height of her fame, discovering that her own face was still being sold on store shelves without her knowledge, tucked inside a plastic box on a toy aisle. CBS argued in court filings that it held exclusive rights to the Elly May character and did not need her personal permission at all. The case was eventually settled in December 2011 on undisclosed terms, but the underlying discomfort of the situation, that her own image could simply be picked up and used by corporations decades after the show ended, without so much as a phone call to the woman whose face it actually was, stayed with her. By 1980, the same year her second marriage quietly ended, Donna Douglas had effectively stepped away from acting altogether. For most Hollywood stories, this is the exact point where the narrative turns bitter, where a formerly famous face fades quietly into obscurity, watching from the sidelines as an industry that once adored it simply moves on. Donna Douglas's story does something almost nobody expects. Instead of fading, she redirected all of that energy toward the things she had genuinely cared about all along, long before Hollywood had ever found her sitting on a farm in Pride, Louisiana. Her Christian faith, which had already quietly shaped decisions like the cigarette commercial she turned down years earlier, became the true center of her post-fame life. She became a gospel singer, eventually releasing several full Christian albums over the following decades, recorded not to chase some new form of stardom, but because she genuinely wanted to use the same voice that had charmed millions of television viewers to bring comfort to people going through hard times of their own. She never became a major recording star in gospel music, and by every account from people who knew her, she never once wanted to be. She simply wanted her songs to reach the specific people who needed to hear them. In a decision that surprised almost everyone who thought they had her figured out, Donna Douglas also built a genuinely successful second career in real estate, primarily around the Baton Rouge area, using her earnings from acting to invest wisely and consistently in property over the years. She became a fully licensed real estate agent and developed, by all accounts, a sharp, disciplined eye for property values, a skill set that had nothing to do with acting talent and everything to do with the same practical, no-nonsense character she had grown up with on that working farm decades earlier. Perhaps the single most striking chapter of her post-Hollywood life came in 1982, when Donna Douglas, already 50 years old and long past the absolute peak of her fame, enrolled at the Rhema Bible Training Center in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. She spent 2 full years there, studying children's ministry with the same discipline she had once brought to a network audition, and graduated in 1984 with a specific focus on working with young people. This was not a publicity move dressed up as spirituality. There was no film premiere or magazine cover waiting on the other side of that degree. It was, by every account from people who actually knew her, a genuine calling she felt personally compelled to answer. She went on to speak at churches, community events, and gatherings across the country for years afterward, sharing not stories of Hollywood glamour, but stories of faith, humility, and the values that had shaped her long before anyone in America knew her name. She wrote 2 children's books, rooted in her Christian beliefs, and even published a cookbook late in life blending her southern Louisiana roots with her Hollywood years. Her personal life, unlike so many of her famous contemporaries from that same golden era, remained remarkably free of scandal for the rest of her days. After her first brief marriage to Roland Bourgeois Jr. as a teenager, which had produced her only child, Douglas married again in 1971, this time to Robert M. Leeds, the director who had personally helmed several episodes of the Beverly Hillbillies during its run. That marriage lasted until 1980, ending in a quiet, uneventful divorce without the kind of tabloid drama that consumed so many of her fellow celebrities during that same period. She never remarried after that. For decades afterward, Donna Douglas lived a life that most former A-list television stars simply don't choose for themselves. She avoided the paparazzi circuit almost entirely. She made occasional, genuinely warm appearances at fan conventions celebrating the Beverly Hillbillies, always happy to sit and talk with the fans who still adored Elly May decades later. But she never chased the spotlight the way so many of her peers continued to once their own fame began to fade. When asked in a 2003 interview how she truly felt about the role that had come to define her entire public life, she said Elly May had been like a door opener for her, a role people genuinely loved. And that even though a role like that could open doors, it was substance and integrity that actually carried a person through them once they were open. In 2014, Donna Douglas received a diagnosis that would ultimately change everything: pancreatic cancer, a disease notorious throughout the medical world for its stealth and its aggression, frequently going undetected until it has already advanced significantly beyond the point of easy treatment. There is something genuinely unsettling about how quietly that particular disease operates, how little warning it tends to give the people carrying it, and how fast it can move once it is finally discovered. She fought it with the same quiet, stubborn determination that had defined her entire life, largely out of the public eye, surrounded by her family in the small Baton Rouge suburb of Zachary, Louisiana, the very same state she had left decades earlier as a young single mother who had never even been on an airplane before. Those close to the family said she rarely discussed the diagnosis publicly, choosing instead to spend what time she had left the same way she had spent most of her adult life, quietly, privately, and surrounded by the people who actually knew her, rather than the millions who only knew Elly May. Her son, Danny Bourgeois, stood by her side throughout the entire ordeal, along with her brother, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. On January 1, 2015, Donna Douglas passed away peacefully in her own home. She was 82 years old. The news reached fans across the entire country almost instantly, and tributes poured in from people who had grown up watching her on Friday nights decades earlier, many of them born long after the original broadcast had already ended, because the Beverly Hillbillies never really left television at all. It aired in continuous syndication for decades after its original run, meaning generation after generation of brand new viewers kept discovering Elly May Clampett long after Donna Douglas herself had quietly walked away from Hollywood entirely. and in a strange and slightly uncomfortable way, kept discovering a version of her frozen permanently at 29 years old on a television screen, even while the actual woman behind that image aged, fought lawsuits over her own face, battled a silent disease, and eventually passed away completely out of the public eye. People who worked with her, who knew her personally away from the character that made her famous, consistently described the exact same thing: a genuinely sweet, unpretentious woman who seemed remarkably similar to the character that had made her a household name, not because she was performing that persona for anyone watching, but because in many real ways, she had simply never stopped being the girl from Pride, Louisiana, who grew up milking cows and swinging from vines with her brother and cousins. What makes Donna Douglas's story stand apart from so many other classic Hollywood biographies isn't tragedy in the traditional sense, and it isn't scandal. It's something quieter, and in its own way, more unsettling. A woman who became famous almost entirely by accident, who watched that very fame trap her creatively for the rest of her professional life, who spent decades fighting to protect a face and a name that corporations kept treating as public property long after she had walked away from the business entirely, and who responded to all of it not with bitterness, but by quietly and deliberately building an entirely new life around faith, family, and genuine service to others, all without needing a single camera pointed at her while she did it. So here's what I want to know from you. Donna Douglas walked away from Hollywood at the height of her fame and spent the rest of her life fighting, quietly and repeatedly, just to hold on to ownership of her own image. Does that change the way you see her story? And do you think more classic stars from that same golden era went through the exact same thing without anyone ever finding out? Tell me in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.